I am Nahid Kabbani, and this is the Lighthouse for today's viewers. Welcome to our show. Today we have an excited story from an excited woman. You know her, she came to our show before, she was our guest, but also she has so many things to talk about it today. We have Miss Alison Wier, the former journalist, American journalist for the Middle East. I will let her remind you, refresh your memory about herself, then we will see what she has in her pocket for us today. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Will you please refresh our viewers' memory about you?
Sure. My name is Alison Wier. I'm just sort of a regular American. I was a journalist at a very small Northern California city. I was the editor of the weekly newspaper there that just covered local issues. Then I got curious about Israel-Palestine in fall of 2000 because that was a major uprising and it was briefly in the news. And I just got curious about it, finally. I'd never looked into Israel-Palestine before, like most people. My background is not Jewish or Arab, so I had never really looked into it. And when I did, I was shocked at what I started to learn. Increasingly outraged and troubled, so much so that it seemed like the biggest cover-up I had ever seen, and I think it's true. So after a few months, I decided to go over there as a freelance reporter, just with my notebook and a camera, and see firsthand what was going on. I traveled around Gaza and around the West Bank. The occupied Palestinian territories is the official term for them, in early 2001. So when I saw what was going on firsthand, and I knew it was my American tax money, over $8 million per day, more than any other country on earth. One of the smallest and richest countries gets more than all the sub-Saharan African countries, all the countries of South America and other places put together. So since I knew it was my tax money, I had seen firsthand that children were being shot, entire residential neighborhoods were being shelled, long before any rockets had been fired, long before Hamas was elected. Those are the pretexts now for Israeli actions. Long before that, I saw what was going on. So when I came back, I started the organization If Americans Knew, to be informative, non-doctrinaire, non-partisan, journalistic, and to do two things: to inform Americans about what's really going on in the Middle East with our tax money, about the history of it, and also to study, monitor, and analyze the U.S. news coverage, because I feel that's, in a democracy, in a democratic republic, the most important institution in many ways is the press. It's so important it was in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of press, because it's essential to be fully and accurately informed, because that's how we decide what we're voting for, who we're voting for, what policies we want. And if the press breaks down, as it sometimes does on other issues too, but on this one it's probably far worse even than on others, then we're not getting the information we need, and we're in great danger of having policies that are both tragic in other parts of the world and extremely damaging to Americans. So that's, I guess, my brief background.
That would be great. So since that time you are focusing on Palestinian
For 12 years now. For 12 years now, I've been focusing on this area that I hadn't known much about before. I've traveled there, of course, now many times. I've seen it firsthand many times, and I've also researched it a great deal. So I've I've learned a huge amount that I didn't know before, and really much more than many people know on it, because this is what I do full time.
That's wonderful. I know you have been involved with traveling so many places. We will not open the subject right now, but I think you have an article today. You wrote an article.
That's correct. I just wrote an article today that's sort of about both of those aspects. It's about what's going on in the Palestinian territories and in Israel, and about the press not covering it the way that they normally would and should cover it. The basic story is that there is a young man, a little bit over 33 years old, named Samer al-Isawi. I'm probably not pronouncing it well.
No, you did good. Al-Isawi, yes.
Who is being held in an Israeli prison, as are about 5,000 Palestinians right now. This young man has not been charged with a crime officially. They've made a sort of strange accusation, but he's not been charged with a crime, and he's not been tried. There's been no trial. He's been treated with the usual brutality that Palestinian prisoners have within those prisons. And because he's being held really illegally, even under the Israeli system, which is a very Kafkaesque system, he's being held illegally, mistreated. He was one of the Palestinian prisoners who were released in a prisoner exchange about 2 years ago. Now they grabbed him again. They're holding him again. Who knows how long that they would hold him, probably 20 years, maybe longer than that. So in desperation, he went on a hunger strike. That's how somebody that's being really cruelly mistreated can make a point. The hope is that the world, that does often step in when there's oppression or injustice or cruelty, would pay attention and help this young man. So he's now been on a hunger strike for over 6.5 months.
Wow.
That's approaching the world record for a hunger strike. Gandhi's longest hunger strike against the British was 21 days, 3 weeks. There were a number of Irish men who went on hunger strikes against the British back in the 1980s. 10 of them died for hunger strikes that lasted about 2 months, maybe 3 months.
Wow.
He's now into 6.5 months worth. As you can imagine, he can't walk anymore. He's having trouble speaking. His heart rate has slowed way down. He's lost half his weight. His internal organs are starting to break down. And he could die at any minute.
And without trial, without nothing?
No trial, nothing. And this is newsworthy. Imagine if an Israeli were held by Palestinians. None are. If one Israeli were held by Palestinians, it would be headlines. We would hear about it fairly often.
Absolutely.
Here we have someone that's been on a hunger strike for 6.5 months, and the Associated Press has not done a single story on him.
Where is the United Nations? Where is
well, Amnesty International is known for helping prisoners. They have a designation called prisoners of conscience. They have people at risk that they highlight around the world. They also had not mentioned anything about Samer Isawi. So I began to notice this and think how outrageous it was. So I called up Associated Press and asked, why are you not covering this? You know, is it that you don't think it's important?
He's nobody.
Is it, you know, what? There must be some rationale. I'd like to know it. Maybe you have maybe there's some reason for it. I can't imagine what it would be, but you know, this is your chance to tell me. And as usual, they refuse to answer any questions.
Okay.
Even though Associated Press calls for transparency from everyone else, as they should, they never practice it themselves. They have the power and they abuse it. You know, what is it? Ultimate power, you abuse ultimate. I can't remember the quote. So Amnesty International, which I used to be, I guess I'm on some of their lists. I have been a member of it before. I've donated to it before. So I contacted them. Why had they not sent out a single alert in 6 months of a hunger strike? Over 6.5 months. For the last few weeks, increasingly near death, potentially. And I also could not get an answer from them. So I finally wrote an article telling the facts about this young man, about his condition, and about the fact that Associated Press wasn't covering it, and even Amnesty International wasn't covering it. And of course, for those of us, it's easy to get cynical.
Yes.
A lot of people that work on this issue, or Palestinian Americans, just sort of say, oh, of course, they never do. That's not the right attitude, I feel. We should be outraged every time they do it, even though they do it all the time. Each time it's outrageous, unethical, unprincipled behavior, and we should oppose it. And people do. So now, today, finally, Amnesty International sent out an alert about him.
Okay.
The one catch is Amnesty USA has not done that yet.
Oh, wow.
So the one in London sent it out. The one in the US that I especially have tried to have called quite a few times, have emailed quite a few times, have talked to a few people, they still haven't done it. So we'll see maybe tomorrow. I hope that they'll do it then.
Too much.
This is too much.
Yeah, when you see a human being we make the choices between this guy or that guy. As a human being, they have the same rights. And as you mentioned, if he didn't do that harm,
well, here's what he's accused of. Although, as I say, these are kangaroo courts anyway. Even when there is a trial, it's people will be found guilty because they signed a quote confession in Hebrew, and in many cases they don't even speak Hebrew. So even a conviction in an Israeli court, if you're Palestinian, means very little. It doesn't mean that they're guilty.
Yeah.
It's a kangaroo court. But in this case, of course, there hasn't been any trial or any charges. But the accusation, the unofficial one, because this isn't, legally they're not filing these papers, but the unofficial one that Israel is claiming is that when they released this prisoner, he was not to be allowed to leave Jerusalem. Somehow they decide where someone can go or where they cannot go. And of course, as you know and I know, they do this all the time to lots of people.
Yeah.
But, this was supposedly the agreement. I'm not sure that it was, but this is what they say. Perhaps it was. And they picked him up. They forcibly arrested him. I would call it kidnapped him. Near a village called Hizbah, which is actually, as it turns out, in the metropolitan limits of what Israel calls Jerusalem. So even according to their own accusation, and they don't seem to dispute the location, so even according to their accusation, he's not in violation of anything. And yet here he may die.
They make their own rules.
They make their own rules. And they do it with our tax money.
That's the sad part. And there are so many ways and places to talk about this issue. Let's have a break and come back again. So we'll have a break and we'll see you shortly.
You're watching The Lighthouse for today's viewers, brought to you by oneworldforyou.org.
So, after the article, Ms. Alison will talk about her trip. First step, where did you go?
Well, as you know, I've been on several trips in the last few months. So I'll just sort of tell them, and then we can talk about one at a time, probably. The most recent one was to London and to Wales. So I was in the UK for about 2 weeks. Before that, I was on a trip to Baghdad, to Iraq. And before that, quite a few months before that, I was in Doha, Qatar, at a conference there. That's right.
So that trip after the Palestinians have a state, or something like this, or belong to this story? You went.
Well, what the trips were for, the one in London, I just mentioned briefly, was very interesting. It was a conference for the Palestinian Return Center that's based in London. This is a very important issue that again is often swept under the rug. Most Americans don't know this kind of issue, but I think it would be it's very clear to us. What it is basically, imagine as an American that you were thrown off your land and it was taken over by other people and given a different name. That's what happened to Palestinians within my lifetime. There was an area called Palestine, a movement called Zionism, which was a very ideological movement. It was not a religious movement, decided that they wanted to create a Jewish state there. And again, a ethnically Jewish state there, even though the land of Palestine was already inhabited by a population that was 95% non-Jewish. So through violence over a number of decades, they managed to get rid of a large portion. Eventually they expelled close to 800,000 men, women, and children. Now all refugees on earth, according to international law and just normal fairness, have the right to return to their homes. In almost all cases, that's what happens. In this case, because Israel doesn't want non-Jews there, this is an unpleasant kind of topic because this is very different than the way most of us feel. We feel you should just be treated the way you are as an individual, not differently because you're a different religion or a different race or a different ethnicity. But Israel is based on the concept of difference. And one group is to be there, and all other groups are not welcome.
Because they own the land from God. That's what they believe, and they came
well,
back to
some
this
believe
land.
it, but
and it was Palestine since Jesus. Jesus
but you
born
see,
there, I guess.
That's right. 60% of Israelis are not religious.
I know.
And so they don't really believe that, and yet they claim that. But since you've brought it up, we need to answer that because some people do think that. They think, well, God gave this land to Moses or Abraham, I guess it is, and therefore the Jews get to have it. Well, that's just not theologically a very strong argument for both for Jews and for Christians. It's not. Now for Christians, which is my background, we believe that with the coming of Jesus, the message and the covenant was made with all human beings, that there was no longer supposed to be one little chosen group that was more important than others. The message of redemption and of love and of peace was extended to all human beings. And so anybody that's a Christian really should understand that, I would think, and I think many do. Some take some scriptures, mostly from the Old Testament, some from the New Testament, out of context, often mistranslated, and think that means that there is going to be this violent return of Jews there, and there will be this massive battle, massive numbers of people will be killed, and somehow that will bring back Jesus. It's a very sort of complex kind of theology, and another time you could have a religious person, a pastor or a minister who could talk about it in more depth, but people that have really studied the Bible closely and what it actually says and what all the scriptures mean together say that just doesn't make any sense. Now people that believe that, I think still, if they saw what was going on there, would realize that's not what, these actions are not actions that would be endorsed by Jesus or by God. And if there's supposed to be this return, as it's called, this isn't the way it would be, and it would probably not be now. So one other thing is that really a large number of Jewish Israelis are European Jews. Yeah. And there's a great deal of evidence that their ancestry does not go back to the ancient Israelites anyway, that they're not, if you believe in that kind of inheritance, bloodline inheritance of a land, it still doesn't apply to them because there's a lot of evidence that there was a conversion back about 1,000 years ago, and that there's still no roots and no clear kind of descent from the ancient Israelites.
So the trip was in London. What did you do in London?
Well, I was at this conference about the right of return, and I also spoke at a few different colleges in London and in the UK. One of them was not in London. It was actually in Greenwich, the famous place of Greenwich Mean Time. So, and then I also spoke in Wales. And since I have a great-grandfather that was from Wales, and I've never been to Wales before, that was exciting.
That's really excitement, it's sure.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful group of people that were there. Then my other trip was to Iraq, and that was for a conference about Palestinian prisoners, interestingly, since that's what the article I just did was on. And again, the idea was that this is something that we all need to do something about. There are, as I said, I should have looked up the exact number of changes. In the last 12 years that I've been focusing on this, at one time it was about as high as 12 or 13,000 people were in prison. Right now it's around a little under 5,000 people are in prison, including many children. Quite a few children, quite a few women, quite a few old men, just all sorts of different people are in prison. So this was a conference about, truthfully, just talking about it. I think conferences are, not always a good use of time because usually you just talk. So there was a lot of talk about prisoners, but there were some former prisoners who were there that told their story.
Dialogue always good, and when you open the subject for discussion, people will understand more and share with the thoughts and the ideas, and maybe put in or take out from the speeches and things, and they will learn something new and will be aware of that new thing comes to their mind and their way.
That's
and
right.
They start thinking from that point. They start to be interested about the subject.
They do. And I was a guest there, so I shouldn't complain. I was pleased to be allowed to go to it, but sometimes there's the concern that the sponsors of these conferences could do something more effective than just hold a conference.
Yeah,
but politically they're a little afraid to do that, and not necessarily afraid. Maybe it's a rational evaluation of the reality, because the reality is the United States right now is the most powerful country.
It's a sensitive topic.
We do whatever Israel tells us to do.
It's sensitive.
So nobody wants to oppose the U.S. or Israel because that's where the power is.
Especially if you start talking about, that means you are at the beginner, elementary school still, and you cannot share or shine that much or focus on certain points because the people are involved, or the countries are involved, Israel and the United States and Britain somehow. So the largest 3 countries in the world.
Well, not largest for Britain.
The Israel, the strongest, the
maybe,
powerful.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, certainly Israel is one of the smallest, but very powerful. Yeah. And of course, we're very big and very powerful. And Britain used to be very powerful and is still very influential. I mean, it's a wonderful, I loved visiting there.
And most of the people think that Israel have the right to live this way, and nobody maybe like to open that subject widely and talk about it deeply, because it might show us the truth. And the truth hurts sometimes.
But who does it hurt, do you think?
Who held that conference? He liked to shed some light.
That's right.
Too much light.
I see what you mean. Yes, that makes
so
sense.
At least 101.
Yeah, that's right. And it was valuable because in some very important ways. Meeting interesting, committed people is wonderful to do and very valuable. Yeah. And hearing directly and meeting some of these prisoners, which I had met other people in the Palestinian territories, but these are people I had not met. There was a little boy there who told his story that I'd read about and heard about, but being there in person, and
A
it
lot
did
of
get
stories, sad stories.
That's right, a lot of sad stories. So that's what that one was, and of course, being in Iraq, I was only there a few days. I didn't get to see much of Iraq, but I did go around Baghdad a little bit. I was able to because another person helped me do that. Most of the attendees weren't able to. And I visited the University of Baghdad, met with the chairman of the political science department, and then we saw some of the classrooms there at the university, and that was
back to
interesting.
normal after the war.
Yes, it looked normal. What I saw looked normal. The students looked very normal and engaging and interested in having us come there.
Yeah.
There are about three of us that were there, and so what I saw looked normal. I know if I'd seen much more of the country, it was still, people are concerned about danger. There were certainly a lot of military presence around.
Still, Iraq has a lot of universities and high quality education people, a lot of scientists.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, especially before these two
the war.
invasions.
Before the war.
That's right.
So things changed, but as you mentioned, you shed some light about the topic. Whoever become interested, he will find a way to dig in and search more and know more about it. But it doesn't have to be in the conference, all of it.
No, that's right.
You did wonderful. So we'll have a break and talk about other visit in the other area. So we'll be back soon.
oneworldforyou.org, promoting cultural understanding through the media.
So with Miss Alison Wier, we went fast to London, then to Iraq, then we will hear from her where else she went there and let us know about details.
Sure. I think I'll maybe skip Doha, even though that's a very fascinating location. But the more interesting story I think that people might be interested in was my trip to Arizona. Not necessarily as exciting as a trip to Doha, but very exciting for me because what it was in my research for this, what was going to be a long article, and now it's a very short book that I hope will be coming out actually in a few months, about the history of U.S.-Israel relations, where I found all these amazing things about what have gone on in this country over the last 100 years, because this movement to create and then to sustain Israel has been around for 100 years. It started around the 1900. And most people have never even heard of it. And yet we have a movement in this country that most of us, including myself, had never really heard of, that has changed this country enormously and that runs our policies on the Middle East. And yet, we've all heard of communism or socialism or fascism, and most of us, even the people in this room, might have trouble defining Zionism. I know I would not have been able to before, but so here we have a major movement in the United States that almost nobody knows about. So anyway, in researching all of that, I stumbled across an amazing story. I have most of my article written. I'm still filling in details, and one of the details was I had a few statements about a man named Rabbi Korff, Korff, that he had formed an organization in the United States in the 1940s that was actually a front group for one of the terrorist gangs that were in Palestine at the time. Actually, it was he was connected to both the Irgun and the Stern gang. They were just very violent groups. Even the mainstream Zionists that were quite violent did not like them. So he had this front group. There were a lot of front groups in the U.S. that people thought were very benign. They had major figures would be part of these groups, would be on their boards of directors, would endorse their events, and didn't know they were raising money for violent terrorist activities in Palestine in the 1940s. So he was one of those people. I just had a few sentences about him. He wasn't wasn't considered a major one, but I needed his first name. You know, you can't write an article and not have the first name. So because of the wonders of the internet, I started to search to just find his first name. And I stumbled across more and more. I discovered that he was much more involved with terrorism than I had thought originally. And eventually I got little clues here and there, and it would lead me to the next clue, and that would lead me to the next information. And it turned out that he was part of a plot in Paris in 1947, where they were going to get an airplane and fly it over London and bomb Parliament. This was, you know, he was an American. England had just been our ally in this war against Hitler, and he was going to bomb Parliament. Then he changed the idea to bombing the Foreign Ministry of London. The reason that it didn't happen is that Rabbi Korf could not fly an airplane, and his other conspirators could not. But he recruited a young American who was about 25 years old, an ace pilot from World War II, named Reginald Gilbert, who was going to fly the plane. Gilbert pretended to go along with the plot, but he secretly went to the U.S. Embassy and exposed it. Then the U.S. Embassy went to the Paris police and Scotland Yard and told him to pretend to go along with it, and then they would arrest everybody before they actually took off, and that's what happened. So in researching that, I tried to find out more about this amazing young Reginald Gilbert who had done that. He was originally from, his mother was from Alabama, his father was from St. Louis, Missouri. He had been a World War II ace pilot. He had, I think, had 136 missions, and he shot down 3 German airplanes. He'd gotten the highest Air Force medals. That time was the Army Air Corps. So an amazing person who had foiled this plot. I kept trying to find out more about him. And eventually I kept looking for an obituary. Usually that's where you find more of somebody's life story. I couldn't find it. I eventually tracked his name down to Arizona, to Scottsdale, Arizona. I called up information, asked for Reginald Gilbert, and he was there. He was in, the name was there. So I called up Reginald, I called up this phone number and said, a woman answered the phone, and I said, I'm trying to locate a man who foiled a bombing plot in Paris in 1947, thinking somebody might think this was very strange. And the woman answered the phone and said, you've got the right place. So it turned out that was her husband. I talked to him and I talked to her. And then eventually I flew to Arizona to meet him in person and to get his story in person.
Wow. This is the power of research.
That's right. And then the amazing thing is, and even before I'd met him, again, with the research that you can now do, you can find a lot of the newspapers. By the way, at the time of this plot in 1947, this was headlines in newspapers all over the country, so you can find those archival newspapers. But then, as looking into both of these, it turned out that Baruch Korf, who was this would-be assassin, later on became good friends with a U.S. president, with Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon called him, sort of jokingly, but he called him my rabbi. They were such good friends. And Korf was very influential in forming Nixon's views about Israel, of course, and other aspects. And yet none of the stories that told that, almost none of them mentioned anything about his actions as a terrorist.
No, for them it wasn't terrorism.
But we're Americans, so for the American media he was a terrorist. In fact, that's how the headlines read. They would say foiled terrorist plot. So again, I don't look at it, yes, I don't really think it's especially important to think about how Israel views it, it's important to think how Americans would view it.
Yes.
And it was viewed as a terrorist
Yes.
action, except then it was whitewashed.
Yeah, it is, but they soften it.
Uh-huh.
It is terrorist, but they soften it. So really, the internet brought us a lot of maybe treasure. Sometimes you can call it, but sometimes as much as it is, hard to believe the history, the old time and things which we didn't. We were young. We were not aware of things. Like you are talking about something, I don't. I am belong to that area, but I don't remember anybody
Well, you
talk
probably
about
would
it.
have been
I was young, a little
10
girl.
years old or 8 years old or something, maybe when it
5
happened.
years old,
Yeah.
1941
Oh,
until
yeah.
47.
That's right.
But
That's right.
also that generation, for us as kids at that generation, without TV, without the new life, the simplicity at that time, you don't hear or read or listen to things more than your school and your family as kids. We don't have any interest more than this area or that area. Even America, the kids were not better than Middle Eastern kids. But after 1950, for World War I, everything changed. Technology and things start little by
Truthfully,
little.
though, I think at that time, again, it wouldn't be relevant to us. I might not have been born. I was maybe, depending on what month. I was born in 1947, so I was either an infant or not even around yet. But for the adults of that generation, most people read daily newspapers.
Yes.
And this was well covered in the daily newspapers.
Yes.
It was amazing for
And
me
the
to see
adults
all of this.
specifically.
It was in just every newspaper
Yeah.
around the country. And of course there were newsreels. People used to see it when they would go to the movies. I even remember those from when I was young. And there were, radio was a big thing.
Yes.
So, these types of
Radio
things.
more than TV now at that time.
I think, I think it's possible that people were, even though there wasn't the abundance of media that there is now, I think people followed it quite a bit. There was less other entertainment.
Yes.
When you think about it now, instead of doing that, you can be on your computer playing games or doing all these other things. And back then, you couldn't do as many. I think people did actually pay attention to the news quite a bit. That was part of what was interesting to do.
It should be, but it didn't go out that much because maybe it's not for suitable for the public to know more and more or talk about it more and more. Maybe media things or didn't show it.
So
up.
you're thinking that people didn't pay attention at the time?
Absolutely. If they pay attention, they will, ask questions. They will do something. But maybe they feel Israel is part of America. Maybe they feel those are our friends, ally or something. So
I think
they don't pay attention that from that point of view to make it a big issue.
Well, I think they would have, but there was a cover-up going on even then, because even though this was in the news for a while, it's interesting to see what happened is very soon, the same type of thing that goes on today was happening. So even though he was going to be dropping these explosive bombs, he was also going to be dropping pamphlets, propaganda pamphlets that were actually very, the terminology, the wording in them was really quite ruthless and violent, but they were pamphlets. So after a while, the people that are often the gatekeepers, the pro-Israel people in the media, changed the story more and more into saying, well, he was just going to drop pamphlets. It sounds much more benign than dropping bombs.
Yeah.
So, again, the cover-up, the story was reported widely for a while, then the cover-up set in. Eventually, there was pressure brought on the State Department, and he was released. I don't think it was a lack of Americans not being interested. It was, again, this cover-up that went on within the media.
And now you wrote that interview with that person?
It's in this article that's on our website. There are two websites, ifamericans.knew.org and councilforthenationalinterest.org.
Okay. Oh.
So I've got an early version of this book that's on both of those websites that I think
Okay.
people would find interesting.
Okay, I'll
It's,
have it on the
it's-
screen. I'll have the information on the screen.
Yeah, I put it up early. It's not because I thought the information's so important.
Yeah,
so it's
those are
an early draft.
very
It's not
new
perfect,
and
but
very important to know, the result of your trips. You are working hard for those issues and you brought something. You should know about it. So we'll continue talking about after the break. We'll give you a break. The stories are heavy a little bit. We'll be back soon. So, after this long trip with Alison Wier around the world, and after that, heavy stories and details and her research also, we will have the addresses on the screen, and we will see what we can hear from Alison as a conclusion of her trips and her hard work. So, what do you think
sure.
we can wrap or
That's
no?
right. Maybe I will tell a little bit about the other conference that was specifically about Jerusalem, which is, I think we have a map here. And Jerusalem, this is sort of a map of Palestine, of what Palestine was. All of this was Palestine. Some of it now, I don't think we have maybe we'll have a different map that can show people the what's called the Green Line, which is basically the border of Israel. When you see the map, it's interesting to remember that we always hear about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. But in actuality, Israel has never named its borders, and it has no constitution, intentionally. So it's not really what I would call a normal democracy in any sense of the word. And as I say, the borders aren't even, it intentionally didn't name the borders because its plan, the leadership's plan, was to take it over.
What about the walls? Are not borders now?
Well, there's a wall that's going around that doesn't show on this map, where there's an armistice line from actually about 1949 that people call the Green Line, because on most maps it's green. Probably all maps, I would assume. And so that's sort of the official, unofficial border between what is called Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, which are their official name. Israel is building a wall along that armistice line, allegedly, but actually it goes in and takes more and more land of Palestinian land, which again under international law is just not legal. But in the world it seems to be might makes right, and so they take what they want, and that's what that is. But anyway, the conference that I went to was about the city of Jerusalem, which is an amazing place. As you know, it's just ancient and beautiful, and it has these ancient stone edifices, churches, mosques, temples, streets, homes.
Yeah. It's a holy land.
That's right.
Area.
It's truly an amazing place to visit, especially the old city, the walled city. So it's very central to what's going on today, because it is a holy land for three major religions, for the Jewish religion, for the Islam, and for Christianity. All have very important holy sites there. And the idea was that it was the UN, when they were trying to come up with a solution for the violence that was in Palestine because of Zionism. It had not been there before. There had been centuries before, there had been the Crusades, but for the past several centuries, it had been really very much at peace. But when Zionism came in to take it over to create a Jewish state, then there was this violence. The UN was going to try to come up with a solution, but it was very influenced by Zionists. So anyway, part of the solution that they came up with, one of the parts that was actually a good one, I think, was that Jerusalem would be an international city, because then all three faiths would be welcome there and would basically run it. But now it's most of it's under the control of Israel. They've annexed most of it. They keep expanding how much they've annexed. And so this conference was about Jerusalem, how to make it open for all faiths, and the problems there.
Yeah.
When you go to one of the oldest churches in Christendom, it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's very interesting, because not only is it a fascinating church to visit, but because there are all these splits within Christianity, as there are in the other religions also, nobody could decide who would be in charge of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, who would hold the keys. Would it be the Catholics? Would it be the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, or the Presbyterians, or the Baptists, or the Lutherans? So the compromise that they came up with was that a Muslim family would hold the keys. That's how close the friendship was between the different religions there in Jerusalem traditionally. So it's still today, that's the situation. So it was a conference about Jerusalem, and again, it was very interesting. A variety of people came to that. From all different backgrounds, from many different countries around the world, and discussed what could be done about it, what the situation was, because there has been, Israel's taking more and more of the land away from people. A lot of land that was traditionally Christian has now been confiscated, and the Christians have been thrown off. The Christian population of Jerusalem is shrinking enormously. So it's a very sad situation.
Arab Jews are not having their rights there. Arab Jews, even
right.
If you talk about Judaism, they are Jews. But because they are Arab, not European, they have no rights, like the other people, other ethnicity and other religion. Like they are not Jews.
Well, there is a lot of sort of racism in Israel that Israelis have talked about, that's written about in their media. There's a lot of concern about that. And a lot of, when Zionism was created, it had two aspects to it. One was that it was to be a refuge for all Jews, even though the vast majority of Jews said, we don't really want it. We're Americans, or we're British.
That's the point. The Jews as religion is something different than nationality. Palestine is the land and the name of the place.
That's right.
The people name Jews, or the land name Judaism. It doesn't make sense. Religion, you carry your religion wherever you are. Like Muslim now, all over the world there are Muslim. All over the world there are Jews. All over the world they are Christian. You cannot put all Christian in Bethlehem because Jesus born there.
Yeah, that's right.
You cannot name it
And
as
you see,
Christian area and that's it. I want my Christianity here and my people here. Imagine a Muslim goes, European Muslim and Arab Muslim goes to Saudi and sit there. We are Muslim here around the Kaaba. We will sit here. It doesn't make sense. Religion for God, God everywhere, religion everywhere. But the name of the land was Palestine. People live in Palestine.
Oh yes, it was. That's right.
We used to live, story after story, we used to live Christian, Muslim, Jews, neighbors and Palestinians. You don't name the religion. And my neighbor in Kuwait used to swear that when she was in Palestine, they don't know their neighbor's religion until after 20 years they have invitation for wedding. They will know church or imam come to home or rabbi. At that point they know their religion, but they were their neighbors and families and happily living. They don't care about the religion. We are brothers and sisters, we are neighbors. That's the life in Palestine. But to change all these things and say the religion become nationality, it is mixed up and it is confusion.
That's right. And that's why a lot of the Jewish population that was there was under the Jewish population of Palestine when Zionism, this political Zionism started, was under 5% of the population. You know, it was maybe 3 or 4%.
It was 3.
It was mostly concentrated in Jerusalem and then some in Tel Aviv, and I think that was mostly it.
Yeah.
And the original population was very opposed to Zionism for those reasons that you've just described. And Jews around the world were very opposed to Zionism, especially observant ones. There was Rabbi Elmer Berger, who said that exact same thing, and Alfred Lilienthal was another person who was stated very clearly, this is a religion. You know, it's not a state, it's not a country, it's not a nationality. Both of them said, we're Americans. We practice the faith of Judaism.
Yes.
So there was that.
You carry your faith with you wherever you are.
That's right. But that's been the problem with the strange thing about Israel is that it calls itself the Jewish state. That's its official name, the Jewish state, and but it doesn't mean in a religious sense. Although it's become increasing, there is a very strong theocratic aspect to it now. In Israel, you can't have a civil marriage, so you know you have to have an Orthodox
pure Jews
kind of marriage. So there are a lot of now religious aspects about the state that would be very strange to most Americans.
It's really difficult and more confusion coming because also they name themselves the chosen people and this is their land, not occupied land. When you have occupation, there is rules for occupied people, and you cannot have peace without justice for people. But if you talk about this land for me and you are nobody, I have a hard time when I talk about the subject in my show. I try to ask my viewers, give me a name for those people. If they are human, there is a human right to talk about it. If they are not human, what I can give them, what name I can give them? Those people, they are not people in this matter. If they are people, we have to look at their safety or their life or whatever. Even I am taken over, I have responsibility for people around.
Exactly.
For this this country or this area, nothing in the whole world fit that area under categories to match and to say they did it or they didn't do it, to judge what they do. They have their own issues and they live their own thoughts with own thoughts and they put their own rules, like they are different than the whole world. It doesn't make to follow.
Well, there are, as you say, there are laws now that are supposed to of the way an occupying power must treat the civilians under its occupation. They've been written in great detail.
But it doesn't fit there.
And an occupying power is still supposed to protect the civilians. And you're not allowed to confiscate land. You're not allowed to change the demography of a place, which is a polite way of saying ethnically cleanse it.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of very sensible, rational, ethical rules in international law about an occupation that Israel consistently violates. Plus, and being on, occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip, especially, have been occupied, officially occupied, since 1967. That's just insane for an occupation to go on that long.
And people in camps since 1948 in Lebanon or Syria have no life. So whatever we will talk, this is a huge story, and we always talk about it. There is no end of it, and no solution. And without justice, no peace for the whole world.
And of course, it's not. A lot of people do need to understand. It's not just the occupation. It's also what happened in 1947 and 48.
Yes.
A massive ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
Many of the people that there are still many people alive today that were part of that. Certainly,
eyewitness.
That's important.
Eyewitness. So anyway, really, this topic needs shows, not one show. And thank you for coming and giving us at least an idea about your trips and what you got from that, especially the research, what you've done. Thank you very much, and we might have you some other time. And for you, my viewers, I know it was heavy stories, but at least we shed some light about this topic, and we'll let you search and take the addresses from the screen and dig in by yourself, find out how we can describe, how we can help to have those people in little decent life to have peace. Without justice, without food on the tables, people will not calm down. Let's look at them as a human being and find some solution for them. It might help us here too. We'll let you think about it, and until next show, thank you very much and have a good